Um, I wanted to just remind everyone that this CME activity is jointly sponsored by the Queen's Medical Center and the University of Hawaii John A. Burns School of Medicine, Department of Geriatrics Medicine. Joining me this afternoon is our interdisciplinary geriatric echo team. We are all willing to teach and share our collective experience and wisdom with you. Please welcome our advanced practice nurse, Dr. Courtney Nunokawa, who will also be our presenter today. We also have our psychologist, Dr. Lucas Morgan. Our pharmacist, Chad Kawakami, and geriatrician, Dr. Rita Bell Fernandez, are not able to join us today. Just a little bit of housekeeping. As a reminder, the evaluations are required for CMEs and social work CEUs. You'll be able to find the evaluations that will follow the presentation. They'll be in the chat link. We are also offering continuing education for the physician's assistants, and then we provide certificates of attendance for CNAs and other students. Your comments and most importantly, your suggestions for future topics are very much appreciated by the planning committee. About ECHO, we want to emphasize that these ECHO webinar series are a forum for mutual teaching and learning from experts and from each of us on the front lines. As the ECHO motto goes, all teach, all learn. So it will take all of us to create a community of learning. Our ECHO webinar format consists of a short lecture by our presenter with comments from the ECHO Hub team. And you, as the attendees and participant, are invited to provide your comments, your questions, and any case examples. We ask that if you do present case examples, that those cases be kept HIPAA compliant. And this includes not sharing the patient's name, birth date, or other information. I think it's a nice reminder to reflect that our best teachers are our clients and patients. Without further ado, I want to take this opportunity to introduce you to our esteemed speaker today. I was really impressed that Dr. Courtney Nunokawa, not only is she a board certified adult and geriatric primary care nurse practitioner with special interests in integrative and holistic healing, but she's also the interim program director for the Nancy Atmosphera Walsh School of Nursing and the adult and geriatric primary care coordinator for NASAN Doctor of Nursing Practice program. She's also involved as the associate investigator with the Department of Veterans Affairs and has her own private practice called Balanced Brain. I don't know where Courtney ever finds a time to sleep or have fun, but she does. We talked a little bit online, and she does know how to find that balance between life, work. Dr. Nunokawa integrates mindfulness, neurofeedback, and values the goals into her healthcare practice and teaching approaches. She believes that nurse practitioners are empowered to help individuals to feel their best. Thank you again, Courtney, for joining us, and welcome. Her topic will be on what matters most, resilience building. We're excited to hear you share.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. So yes, we'll talk about resilience today. I will start with, I am not a subject matter expert on this topic. I am very interested in this topic, and I wanted to bring it to ECHO to really start a discussion on this from multiple different disciplines. So please feel free to jump in even during when I'm speaking, if you have any comments. And I also wanted to I know if anyone has family or if anyone's affected with the fires on Maui, I think this is, it would be hard for me to shift into the topic of resilience without really recognizing the tragedies that are going on concurrently. So I hope everyone is safe and all your families are safe. Disclosures. So these are my disclosures. I won't repeat them because Sarah spoke about them. So objectives in no particular order, reviewing what matters most from the 5 M's of geriatrics, analyzing resilience theories, and discussing methods for resilience building in clinical practice for our patients and clients. So before we shift into the talk, I actually wanted to, I don't know if anyone's used Slido before, but it's an interactive tool that I use commonly with my students. And so if you can either scan the QR code or go to slido.com and enter that code at the bottom, and you can enter in what you think resilience is, or how do you define resilience? I'm very curious from the group what the definition is, because there's many definitions of resilience out there. Bouncing back after disaster, adversity, flexibility, grit, anyone else? Perseverance, adapting, strength, optimism, coping skills. These are all really good. Strong, strength. So how does the American Psychological Association define resilience? So in older adults, resilience is the ability to adapt well and bounce back in the face of adversity. So I think this group defined resilience. And we really see it as a component of successful aging. Resilience work, my understanding, started in children, led into adults, and now we're really looking at how to build resilience as part of a successful aging model. And this is a topic I think that's really interesting to myself, because we are, I think, as clinicians, as healthcare providers, and healthcare personnel, we're really privileged to see people in some of their most vulnerable and adverse times, or high stress times, which are, commonly associated with medical conditions and major medical events and transitions in life. And it's always really interesting to me to see how the response of individuals to different stressors, and how that response can be different. And can we help our clients and our patients shift into a response that is more resilient and strength, and stronger, and filled with optimism and adaptability and flexibility, all the elements that you all already defined. So I want to play this brief video. It's about a 2-minute video on the science of resilience. It's really focused on children, but I think the science and the brain impacts are pertinent to everyone. So play this.
Resilience is the result of a highly interactive process between individual characteristics in the person and the environment in which that individual has developed.
It's really the counterbalancing of difficult things that may exist in the child's life with positive things that occur within the family, but even positive things that may exist in the community.
An easy way of thinking about resilience is like a scale with a fulcrum in the middle of it. And there are things on both sides of that scale, experiences of both bad things or good things.
Our genes shape where the fulcrum is positioned at the start.
There are certain genes that make a child more sensitive to the effects of maltreatment or parental neglect or witnessing violence.
The fulcrum may start out kind of more towards one side or more towards the other side, and that's going to make a big difference in terms of how much these subsequent events affect things positively or negatively.
Science tells us that experience moves the fulcrum, for better or for worse.
Even though we are born with genes. Genes will respond differently to certain environmental situations as opposed to others.
What the genes are actually doing are turning up or turning down the expression of chemicals in circuits in the brain and the circuitry in the entire body that govern our responses to stress, to anxiety, to depressive symptoms.
When positive experiences accumulate and children learn coping skills that help them to manage stress, the fulcrum can slide, so the scale tilts toward positive outcomes more easily. That's what resilience is all about.
There's always an adult, or more than one adult, who is key to providing that relationship that helps to build resilience.
So this is a framework for resilience. This is really actually from a public health national disaster resilience model, which is really interesting that we are currently experiencing a natural disaster right now in Hawaii. And I'll go into the plan, absorb, recover in a little bit, but it's really, so plan is really the preparation for a major stressor, disaster event. And then absorbing is the ability to take on the imminent acute stressor, the recovery period, and then potentially and hopefully adapting, and that flexibility that someone wrote, back to baseline or even perhaps an improved baseline, right? So many of our clients will say, I experienced this major stressor and I actually came out stronger and more resilient because of it. And ideally that is the spectrum that we want to see. In our older adults, there's an added kind of component, and I think, it's not to physiological aging is happening, and whether that's normal physiological aging or disease and functional decline related to disease, there is this trajectory that we see in function in older adults. And so in many ways, older adults have resilience kind of stacked, or it's harder to develop resilience because there's this ongoing concurrent functional decline. But we can still support our older adults in returning back to their baseline and perhaps even improving that baseline. And this is specifically to geriatric individuals. So comparing populations, and it's not two lines, it's shades of the lines. But essentially, in some situations, a major adverse stressor may result in immediate death in some individuals. And in other individuals, they may have some, they're able to absorb some of it, respond, but maybe not fully adapt and recover. And that has negative outcomes associated with it, perhaps even early death, but also things like functional decline, cognitive impact, that impacts the person's ability to return to their functional baseline or improved functional baseline. And then highly resilient individuals, even older adults, we see that there is this capacity to build resilience and adapt and improve perhaps the critical function baseline, or at least return to baseline. And so this is the hope, is that we actually as clinicians have the ability to make this curve smaller and smaller so that the response to the adversity or stressor can be quicker, faster, and that adaptation and return to baseline. So we are all, I won't kind of go into this too much, but I think we're all very familiar with some of the unique geriatric adversities that are existing even before there's an acute stressor or a major stressor. So stress and frailty, loss of autonomy, physiological aging, whether it's normal or disease related, cognitive impairments, grief and loneliness, and illness and disease. And we know that building resilience is actually associated correlationally with decreased depression and anxiety, increased life satisfaction, sense of meaning and purpose, increased participation in physical activity, which we know has really great outcomes for other disease-modifying activity, decreased experience of daily stress, and lower levels of loneliness. I thought this was a very interesting statistic. So in a study, I think about 170 older adults, they measured resilience in men, women, and then they categorized it by age. And you actually can see for both genders, resilience increases with age. And I think, this is not a causation study, but I think that it is real, like it poses the question, at least in my mind, of is resilience part of the reason why perhaps there's longer lifespan into the 75 plus age group. And even though, despite that, if you think back to that curve of normal physiological aging and that functional decline, resilience is actually higher, right? Like we would expect our 75-year-olds to have more age-related illnesses, maybe more chronic disease burden, but in reality, they can still actually build their resilience higher than the younger, kind of less affected population. So how do we assess resilience? So I thought this was a really good framework to kind of overview resilience. So pre-stressor assessment. So this is our baseline function. So measurements of gait speed, hand grip strength, your biological biomarker, cognitive assessments, frailty assessments, social support, BMI, waist circumference. What is their general risk kind of going into the stressor? And then a major stressor happens, like a hospitalization, chemotherapy, a traumatic event like a major fire and losing your home, losing your spouse or partner. That happens, and then resilience, right? Physical and psychological resilience. What plays into that? So there's the biologics of inflammation, your metabolism, insulin resistance, how does your body metabolize the stress response? But also, cognitively and thought-wise, how are you processing those the major stressor? And the outcome is, so stressor, resilience, outcome, we really recognize, low resilience is associated with death, or earlier death. Functional decline, which we know functional decline is the major predictor of lifespan and longevity. Delirium, which I really see as a response to an acute stressor. Recovery time, and then again, your biometric baselines, right? So from the baseline assessments of the biologic functioning, how does the stressor impact the outcome? And you see that, someone with a hip fracture, they're admitted with a hip fracture, but they're bedridden, they lose muscle strength, and therefore they're not able to rehabilitate as quickly and as fast as someone who is younger and maybe perhaps more resilient. And then therefore leads to secondary infections or secondary complications, and further decline and difficulty returning back to that baseline before the hip fracture. Characteristics of resilience, so things that you want to look for and ask about, right? What are your coping styles? And that someone mentioned that in the initial Slido. What are you grateful for? What brings you a sense of joy and happiness? What is the cognitive status, which we all are probably well aware of and assessing. Mental health as well, that we're well aware of assessing. Optimism and hopefulness. Do they have something to look forward to? Do they have meaning and purpose? How are they managing emotions and regulating those emotions? Social is a big factor. So what are is there a caregiver? What is their support system? Are they connected with a spiritual group? Do they have a sense of meaning, purpose, values? And then the physical, so the ADLs, IADLs, autonomy, even their ability to do things for themselves, and then self-perception of how they are aging. And I briefly want to talk about the stress response. So this is something that we can actually assess for, and there's tools that we can actually use now in my private practice. I work with biofeedback, and stress is really both a physiological and a psychological response. And so, we all have stress in life, and we all have to respond to stressors in life. And ideally, we have a positive stress response where we have the major stressor, we're able to recognize the stressor, adapt to the stressor, and then return to baseline. In other more serious kind of, if you think about the fires, right, like they're absorbing and responding to loss of home, loss of support, loss of community, and are they able to tolerate that stressor and also still recover from it? Or stress can become this prolonged state, and this is where you really see in kind of post-traumatic stress, where the stress response is heightened, and you see physiological changes in things like sleep, heart rate variability, chronically over time. And so ideally, we want to identify stressors, identify how they're managing stressors, and prevent it becoming this chronic, more toxic stress state after the initial stressor. Factors impacting resilience, so things that we can assess for, so biomarkers, which I talked about already, so grip strength, body weight, I think heart rate variability is something that there's lots of research behind on how the nervous system is responding to stress. Cognitive functions, so assessing for depression, delirium, dementia, disease burden, so optimizing diseases, but also assessing for what the burden is. Metabolic and hormonal, so hemoglobin A1C, lipids, vitamin D, testosterone and hormonal levels, ADLs and IADLs in your physical function, and then the social determinants of community, spirituality, resources, economic stability. Resilience tools, so validated tools potentially to use for assessing resilience. I'm curious by a raise of hands if anyone has used these in clinical practice already. Many of them are, from my understanding, predominantly used in the research setting, but the resilience scale for adult is used in clinical practice, and they have developed a geriatric scale for it as well. I was going to go into all of these, but then I thought, many of them are, I think well, I'll go into it when I get into the 5M model. So how do we foster resilience? So this is a framework potentially on how to, the determinants and the ways that we can affect resilience, right? So the individual health choices of health behaviors, stress load, perception, spirituality, age, genetics, epigenetics, social determinants, which we all are well aware of, the human moderated environment, so transit, walkability, which in many cases is also under the social determinants umbrella, and then also natural environment, so weather, available resources that affect our resilience. This is the prepare, absorb, and adapt model. So this is a natural disaster model, but I think it can be applied to individuals as well, right? So there's physical, informational, it's very small, sorry, cognitive, and social. So those are the four kind of domains. So we can help people prepare for stressful situations by optimizing a good state of health, ensuring that the person is aware and accessing relevant and important services, their cognition, they have an awareness of their baseline health and needs and how to maintain that, and social. Do they have a social network that is supportive, and what is their loneliness, etc. And that's really in the preparation phase for a stressor, knowing that potentially there is that we all experience stressors. In the absorbing state, if we stay in physical, it's how do we have the functioning systems available to respond? And so that made me, I really think about, the cascading effect of multi-system organ failure, right? Like an initial physical insult leading to multi-system organ failure really is the lack of the ability to absorb that major physical stressor. Informational, are they able to identify the problems and engage with the resources, right? Are they able to recognize that I am declining and I should go and access those services? Recognizing new challenges in the cognitive domain and adapting, being able to kind of shift into the recovery and adapting phase to mitigate those changes. And then engaging the social network during that acute stressor phase and the absorb and recover phase. And then finally, in the adaptation, we want to, in the physical, although there may be a loss of function, there's an adaptation and perhaps a change in the physical function, or maybe there's not, but we want to see that it's normalized so that they're not in a high stress state, or if there is a physical change, there's an adaptation and improvement and a return to a new baseline, right? So if they had the hip fracture, they were able to get the surgical intervention and the rehab and be able to return to a new baseline that feels resilient and going back to the prepare of what is your good state of health. Informational resource management, cognitive, I think sustained behavioral changes. So are the adaptive changes that were made consistent over time? Are they able to maintain those over time? And then social is, pretty much the same. Are they still connected? If we think about transitions in geriatrics into, skilled nursing or ICF, major impacts to their social connection. Oftentimes we're separating spouses or we're separating people from communities that they were a part of for many, many years. And so how can you facilitate a new social environment to help them adapt and return back to feeling more resilient? Other kind of areas, and I think this is a little bit redundant, but connections, self-care, fostering a sense of purpose, cognitive processing, self-regulation, and physical health. And you can see that this is really a team-based approach. This is not one discipline. This is many disciplines that can help build resilience. So developing socialization, just to show the importance of socialization and the perception of resilience. So good quality relationships, being able to confide in people, frequent contact with family and friends, feeling integrated within a community, and having high developmental and adaptive coping skills is associated with feeling much more resilient. And lower relationships, lower connection, lower coping skills makes a person at risk for lower resilience and more vulnerable to the inability to adapt and recover from major stressors. Challenges and barriers to resilience in practice. So I think there's many reasons why we're not kind of routinely assessing for this and integrating changes into, well, I think we are doing this in many ways, but some challenges. So there's a broad definition of resilience. There's broad definitions on how to assess for resilience, right? So you can really look at it from a physical standpoint. You can look at it from a cognitive standpoint. Ideally, we're looking at it from a holistic standpoint where you're including social, physical, and cognitive. There's varying, that goes into the varying resilience antecedents. So many things that affect resilience. And it's hard to say, if we send person to physical therapy and build their balance and grip strength, will that build more resilience? And it's hard to generate causation, and all the studies are correlational. Assessment tools are mainly utilized in research settings. Resilience is highly individualized, so the needs of each individual person and what builds resilience for them may look different, right? For one person, it may be a mindfulness practice every morning really helps ground them and make them feel build their resilience. For others, it may be a higher kind of a highly social activity, and so it's very individualized. And I think that's where the 5M model really aligns to this. And then competing clinical priorities, right? So when someone's coming in for a hip fracture, we're usually focusing on the hip fracture. We're not kind of assessing for resilience and ensuring that the person is resilient to recover because there's a higher priority need at that time. And so the 5M model as a framework, and there are a few studies that actually cite the 4M model, not the 5M model just because of timing, as a tool and a framework to build resilience. And it really does capture all the assessments and essential interventions that resilience building, that's important in resilience building, right? So assessing fermentation, assessing for mobility, integrating services and care to improve mobility and function, medications, and then what I think is what matters most is that each individual's meaningful health outcome and goals and how to build that sense of meaning, purpose, value for that person, because resilience is highly associated with the sense of purpose, a sense of meaning, and that strength and positive outlook. So this is a brief overview of the what matters most section. So communication, psychosocial and spiritual needs, symptom assessment, patient priorities, and advanced care planning. So I think my students will often just focus on that advanced care planning when we talk about the 5M model. But really in the framework of resilience, focusing on all these areas, we are all probably building resilience in our clients and patients, even if we're not overtly calling it that, because we're utilizing the 5M model. And this, I think I'm running out of time, but I think one other thing that I wanted you all to consider is healthcare providers also can develop resilience. It's a high stress, high burnout profession. And so I hope you all are also thinking about how you foster resilience in your life. So I am curious if you all would like to share how you fostered your resilience. So social connection, perhaps nature, spirituality, processing. It's actually, I ask my patients pretty frequently, like what brings you a sense of joy and happiness? What do you indulge in to feel good? And it's actually kind of a hard question to answer for many people. Exercising, sleep and rest, gratitude, music. These are all really good. So I will urge you all to consider fostering resilience in your own life, but also asking your patients and really framing it in how can we fill our resilience cup so that when a major life stressor happens and it takes out of that cup, we have enough reserve in that resilience in our resilience cup to adapt and overcome major life stressors. These are all really good. And I would like to, that concludes my presentation. I have my resources slide, but I want to leave the Slido up. I'm curious from everyone else what your thoughts are on resilience and how you see it in practice, if it's something that you talk about. I recently had an internal medicine doctor was talking about kind of the gomers of medicine, the ones that kind of like come through the ER and they will, we think they're going to pass, but they don't pass and they recover. And I really thought, that's resilience, right? Like they probably face so much adversity in their life. They're so resilient to some of these stressors, and reframing it from a more negative connotation to really, this person is highly resilient.
I think about, Courtney, the COVID situation, and how that really impacted our kupuna. I was working briefly in adult daycare and we had to shut down, sadly, when we reopened. And that was just like, I think there was a third day to shut down, but they had it was interesting. Those that returned, you could see when you speak of resilience, how given the support at home and whatever else they were doing to still stay engaged with that individual, there wasn't as much a significant change as those people that came later. 2 months later, we saw that there was physical cognitive decline. We sadly even heard that people were dying at home, not even from COVID. I don't know if anybody else in the audience had similar kinds of experiences of seeing changes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we're definitely still in the recovery adapting phase of COVID as a population. I think I mean, in geriatrics especially, but also even in younger, social isolation problems, difficulty transitioning. What is the work life now that we're transitioning back into? I just read an article that burnout is like back more than ever. I think there was burnout in COVID, but and then there was some kind of resilience and kind of recovery, and then the burnout is now increasing again as the expectations are returning back to high volume, high output.
Yeah, we're still seeing a lot of cases of COVID in the hospital. I don't think it gets publicized. It's not really publicized as it had been through the beginning part of it, right? Where we'd get weekly reports. But for those of us that are working in the hospital, it really wears you down. You don't know when there's an end in sight.
Yeah. My son actually has pneumonia from COVID right now.
It's crazy.
And
And then
he's
we
like
have people
little.
coming
Should
back
be
with,
resilient.
yeah, and then they come back with a second or third,
Mm-hmm.
infection of COVID. It's just, they have to be pretty resilient.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
On
I
COVID.
just wanted to make a comment on, you talked about how as people get older, they become more resilient. I actually, the way I sort of unfortunately might see it is the survival of the fittest. So as they get older, it's the less resilient that kind of get eliminated.
Sooner.
And so that's why
Yeah.
the ones that survive are the most resilient. But that aside, I also wanted to comment that, I really like this framework in the sense, and just being mindful of needing to address resilience. I guess I never did this in my clinical practice well, it wasn't intentional, but I would do things like, if they're in rehab and they're not rehabbing really well, I would talk to the family, or even on a mission, and talk about, okay, do we have any special dates coming up, any birthdays, any graduations, any weddings, any friends visiting from out of town that we can put a date on and target their recovery for, that they want to be there for that, and so that's sort of putting that out there. And so that's a strategy that I've used to sort of help put that something to look forward to.
Yeah, building that sense of hope and optimism.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't have to be big kind of events or things. It could be very small little things that, like somebody who was lying in bed now can move their feet, their hands, they can smile, versus if they have a stroke or something and they couldn't before. But actually paying attention and bringing it to the person's attention of all the improvements, or the things that have improved for them, and that they are part of the improvement, and so to give them hope. I think that is so important to develop their resilience. Thank you.
Yeah, the self-empowerment piece.
You also talked about purpose, and there is a term called ikigai. And I'm reading a little bit about that ikigai. And I guess people, as part of resilience, need to feel that they have a purpose or meaning in life, or feeling useful.
Yeah, that I think it's, I can't remember, but it's like something that fulfills you, right? Like something that you're contributing to society. And I think there's a third element in ikigai, where to really have that sense of purpose. Yeah, that's a great model, because we oftentimes, I think that brings up ageism in our older adults, right? Like, how do we give them their sense of empowerment and contribution, which they are, subject matter experts or have lots of wisdom and can still contribute tremendously to society.
Yeah, thank you, Courtney. And these frameworks that you bring up and share with us today, I think have been really helpful for me to conceptualize the different aspects of resilience. And is resilience a topic or a word that you actually bring up with folks that you work with? Is it something you actually talk about with them directly?
It is. I really I think that's my personal kind of style, but I talk about a resilience cup, and we have a cup, and we can do things to fill up that cup, right? So we can do self-care, or, whatever feels good, and bring rest and restoration, whatever can fill up that cup. And so when a major stressor or any stressor happens, I don't know, I had a patient who recently had their credit card hacked, and that was like a major stressor for them. We have enough kind of reserves that it won't wipe out the cup. And there's still some left in. And then after the stressor happens, how do we fill that cup back up again? And I talk about internal and external kind of resilience, right? Like there's things that are going to take away or give to our resilience that are external to us. And then there's our own kind of self resilience building. Yeah, that's kind of my style.
Yeah, very cool. And I think it's great, using metaphors to help connect a concept like resilience with clients' own experiences can be really helpful. So there's the cup metaphor that you just mentioned. There's the sort of
the fulcrum,
the seesaw one. And I was just curious, does anyone else present here have any other sort of metaphors that they've used with patients or clients to talk about something like resilience? Is that something that folks have used before? I'm curious. I've used the sort of the metaphor of like caring for oneself as one would care for like a plant, right? We need to be, when we need to be investing and caring and giving ourselves our things that we need, because a lot of folks, this sort of overlaps with the concept of self-care, right? And self-care is sort of a general topic that can relate to resilience. A lot of folks are like, self-care is selfish, right? Doing something for myself is sort of putting myself before others, and that's not something that lines up with my values. But I've definitely used, because I like plants, grow plants, and so it's very intuitive to me, and it can be for others to like, if you're not getting the things you need, the sleep, the rest, the social connection, the things that we might need that are analogous to a plant's needs of water and nutrients and sun, how are we going to be functional and resist or be resilient in the face of stress? So that's one that I've used with certain folks.
I like the plant one. It's a great one. I'm curious if anyone else is talking about resilience in their practice, or perhaps even talking about it without recognizing, like Dr. Wen, about resilience. But now that we have this kind of framework to put it in, if it's coming up. I think the 5M model is very comprehensive to resilience. Oh, sorry, Judy.
Oh, no, not at all. I'm sorry I interjected in between, but I work in the community, and we're always looking at our seniors and suffered tremendous loss, whether it's physical, mental, it's the whole gamut. And then we try to look at where is a starting point for them in particular, because each one is so individualized. And again, looking and focusing on small things, because it's so easy to that to your attention. But before we can connect to that, I think you got to start really small to show what impact they have made in others' lives. So bringing back the past, if they're feeling that they don't contribute anymore, we bring up about their family, that they actually could be a single parent, that they brought up their children in times of hardship, with no financial backing, maybe working a couple of jobs, or making sure that their kids are fed, or whatever it might be, that they gave up so much to have them maybe educated, move on their lives, and that the product of the children is what they achieved because they were there for them. And so they have to be, I think we have to bring that back to the past is so important to bring forth. that they made a tremendous difference in people's lives, and they can continue to do so. Maybe not, it would be in a different in different ways. And so trying to think about the person and what is meaningful for them to help them to develop this resilience wherever they might be.
Yeah, I like that. I'm hearing like, how do we help them adapt to that change? And then I was having volume issues in the beginning, but it sounds like also maybe it's difficult to reflect and kind of what Dr. Morgan is saying. It's hard for us to do self-care for ourselves, but reflecting how a person built resilience in another person so they can see the value of that, and internalize it, and then understand the value of applying it to themselves. Yeah, I really like that. I think Naomi, I've often told patients and caregivers that it's important to take care of ourselves first so we can be well nurtured enough to care for others. We then discuss ways in which they can tend to themselves, carve out time for themselves within the framework of being able to tend to the rest of the responsibilities. Yeah, I agree. I think resilience building is something that it is intentional and is an active, it's not something that just happens. I mean, it is something that just happens in some cases, but in many cases we're actively trying, and in our clients, we want to actively try to have them reflect and integrate that in the same way that we ask them to exercise for 150 minutes a week and eat a healthy diet. We can also ask them to foster resilience in their life.
Yeah, I also want to just share some other thoughts that I have used during providing care. Oftentimes, we're the bearers of bad news. We tell them all the bad diagnoses and all that sort of stuff, and we see them at their lowest moments. But so one of the things, even when they're even in hospice and they have a very short life expectancy, one of my philosophies, I guess, is that don't take anything away from them without giving them something back. And so in a sense, it's not asking them to build their resilience, but we have to give them resilience. Mm-hmm. And one of those examples was that was just shared was that, you tell them what wonderful parents they must have been because their children are visiting every day. And that's just evidence of how awesome and wonderful you are. You give them their resilience back, mm-hmm. or you remind them of things that were really meaningful. And then also, I don't give up on them. I say, well, you know what? We can still do exercises in bed, There's still things we can do to improve your quality of life. Even if you're not going to be running a marathon and walking down the block, if you can get out of bed every day, that improves your quality of life. And let's work on that, because then you can go out and sit with your family outside, or something to just give them this quality of life. To grow that, mm-hmm. even in small ways. And I always believe there's lots of ways, not just big ways, but small ways to give something back to them. Every time you see them, give something to them.
Mm-hmm. I like that. Yeah, I think that really is like that sense of meaning, purpose, but also the adaptation, right? Like, how do we create a new baseline that's really meaningful, and feels like quality, and
And I just wanted to mention that there's, it can often feel challenging to me to help someone feel ready to change in order to increase their resiliency, because in so many cases with older adults, they have had many forms of sort of resilience facilitating behaviors, but then those same behaviors are no longer possible because of changes in functional status, COVID, now you're stuck in your house by yourself, or you're living in a long-term care facility, you can't drive anymore. So all the things that kept you resilient for many decades are no longer possible. And so to foster new resilience, or to create a new baseline of okayness, there has to be some change. And that's that adaptability part. And oftentimes I feel I have that pressure to jump to change already and oftentimes there's a resistance to that change, or a resistance to my suggestion, right? Because mm-hmm. maybe I'm I'm rushing or I'm not validating um, the, the struggle that is very real, the grief or the loss. So I just
Mhm.
wanted that as providers, that's such an important thing to think about is, are we pushing change before change is ready sometimes? Or how do we approach that can be a challenging thing. So I'm just curious if anyone else has thoughts about that.
I think that goes back to that model that you spoke of in the 4 M's. I really take to heart that you mentioned the most important question to ask oftentimes, and this hopefully answers what you were asking, is what matters most to that person, right? If you start with the client is and ask what's most important to them, whether it's a person that's living the last days of their life, at the end of life, or it's someone that sustained an injury, I would say, like, most of the time they can't tell you what's most important to them at that moment, and then kind of build from that. Maybe, huh, Lucas? What about other people?
I thought of my veteran population that I worked with is many of them would come in and say, I used to be able to run 10 miles and, lift really heavy. I don't know the terminology, but, very active, highly resilient, major output that I would never experience in my professional life. To, having either a major event or chronic pain that leads them to not oftentimes do the physical things. And I think there's a big identity shift in that. And I think maybe that's part of that grief and loss, like they almost have to grieve and the loss of who that person was when they were 20, 25, 30, and accept before they're ready to adapt and change. And that can be a long process too. So thank you for highlighting that. We can have all the tools and technology, but if the person is still grieving, their function of their right leg or the ability to walk, it's or having a toe or an amputation. It's a big identity shift. Oh, that's exciting. Yeah, I know this is kind of more of a softer subject, but I think it's really important. And I think it's something that we can really build meaning, purpose, and values in our geriatric adults, hopefully. Yeah, so thank you all. This wonderful discussion. Any other thoughts?
I'd like to say thank you so much for talking about resilience and bringing us back to that framework and how we conceptualize it so that it can turn into more actionable steps in the way that we facilitate our practice in whatever discipline that we're in. And I really appreciate that moving the fulcrum, that we can do different things to support and empower our clients so that hopefully we can get them back to that baseline or to increase their resilience. I was curious about the resilience assessment tools that you had showed on screen. Which one is your favorite, or which one have you found that produces the best I don't know, data that we can use to take action on for a care plan?
Yeah, some of them are specific to transition. So if you're working in the hospital setting or transitioning care, I use the RSA in adults. It's a 25 question assessment. I think the geriatric one is a little bit longer, but I'll actually kind of do it over time, and it's good. I find that it's good feedback for the clients to see how they're integrating changes or integrating adaptations and how they're actually building the resilience. It's more like I don't use it as like in the same way as a PHQ-9 or GAD-7, where I'm really assessing kind of the trajectory of depression management or improvement of depression. And I use it more as a tool for the client and the patient to see how they're developing their resilience over time. And I find that in and of itself is feedback that empowers them to build more resilience.
Thank you. So the RSA, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Any other thoughts? Or I think we can all use 5 minutes of self-care.
Well,
It's an
I had one
assignment.
other comment is as clinicians and private providers in healthcare, we need to model resilience. Got to walk the walk, right?
Yes. Yeah. That was in the back of my mind the whole time is I think we are all need to build resilience because we work in a very high stress, you know, we see a lot of suffering, human suffering. So with that note, 5 minutes, I give you 5 minutes back and you can all build some resilience before your next thing that you have to jump onto. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Courtney, and thanks for
Thank
everyone for
you.
joining today. Please don't forget to do the link for your CE credits for your attendance today, and really appreciate everyone's presence and contributions and discussion. So let's go have 5 minutes, 4 minutes of something restorative. Take a few deep breaths. Go to the
Thank you,
bathroom.
everybody.
Thank you.
Michaela, can we just stay on for a sec?
Yes.
Did I